418 kilograms. That is how much rare earth material goes into a single F-35 fighter jet. A Virginia-class submarine requires 4.6 metric tons. And terbium oxide, one of the 7 critical elements at the center of this story, has risen 103% year-to-date as of March 2026. China controls approximately 85 to 90% of global rare earth processing. And in April 2025, Beijing flipped the switch.
Welcome to Asia Tech Macro. I'm Alex.
And I'm Maya. Today we are talking about China's rare earth export controls, the Trump-Xi deal struck in Busan, South Korea in October 2025, and the ticking clock that is November 10, 2026, when that deal expires and China theoretically regains the ability to reimpose its full restrictions.
This story sits at the intersection of defense supply chains, semiconductor manufacturing, electric vehicles, and the single most structurally underappreciated dependency in the Western technology and military-industrial complex.
Let's start with what actually happened. On April 4, 2025, China's Ministry of Commerce, MOFCOM, issued Announcement Number 18. It placed export licensing requirements on 7 medium and heavy rare earth elements: samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, and yttrium.
And critically, it wasn't just raw ore. The controls covered metals, alloys, oxides, compounds, mixtures, and permanent magnet materials derived from those elements, the entire downstream value chain.
So you can't route around it by sourcing processed materials from a third country.
Not easily, no. The market responded immediately. European dysprosium oxide prices nearly tripled within weeks of the April announcement. Car makers in the US, Europe, and Japan struggled to source permanent magnets. Those are the components that go into EV motors and wind turbine generators. Some manufacturers were forced to cut production utilization rates. This is not a hypothetical disruption scenario. It happened in compressed form within 30 days of April 4th.
And the name rare earths is actually misleading. They are not particularly rare in the Earth's crust.
Right. The IEA has made this point clearly. The elements themselves are relatively abundant geologically. The problem is processing. Converting rare earth ore into usable metals, alloys, and magnets requires specialized hydrometallurgical processes, large volumes of chemical inputs, and decades of accumulated industrial know-how. China built this processing infrastructure over 30 years, often absorbing environmental costs that Western nations were unwilling to accept domestically.
The United States actually used to dominate this industry. Mountain Pass in California was the world's largest rare earth mine.
It was. Mountain Pass closed in 2002 because it could not compete with Chinese pricing. The U.S. spent the next 2 decades effectively outsourcing its rare earth supply chain to a single geopolitical competitor. And the technologies dependent on those supply chains, AI infrastructure, advanced weapon systems, EV drivetrains, have only grown more critical in the time since.
Let's talk about the semiconductor angle, because I think that's the piece that gets underreported in most of the coverage.
Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, CSET, translated MOFCOM Notice 2025 number 61 in October, which was the follow-on escalation. They specifically identified TSMC and Taiwan's broader semiconductor supply chain as, quote, particularly exposed. Rare earths are used in semiconductor fabrication in several ways: cerium oxide for polishing, specialized coatings on fabrication equipment, optical fiber dopants for data center interconnects. The exposure isn't just to EV manufacturers and defense primes. It runs through the core of global chip production.
And on the defense side, the numbers are stark. Lockheed Martin uses approximately 22.6 kilograms of samarium per F-35, and samarium is on the original April list. 418 kilograms total rare earth content per aircraft. For the submarine program, Virginia-class boats require 4.6 metric tons each. The Tomahawk cruise missile, Predator UAVs, Joint Direct Attack munitions, all of them are on the rare earth dependency map.
This is the structural context going into October 2025, and then China escalated further. On October 9th, MOFCOM issued Announcement Number 61, a sweeping escalation effective December 1st, 2025. It would have denied export licenses to any company with affiliation to foreign militaries, including the U.S. military, and it extended controls to parts, components, and assemblies containing Chinese-sourced rare earth materials or made using Chinese processing technologies.
That second round was a completely different order of magnitude.
It was an almost total cutoff mechanism, because if you define parts and assemblies containing Chinese-sourced rare earth materials broadly enough, you are restricting virtually every Western defense contractor, EV manufacturer, and chip company from receiving Chinese rare earth exports. The supply chains are that intertwined.
Which is why Trump and Xi sat down in Busan on October 30th. In Part 2, we are going to break down exactly what was agreed and exactly what was not, because Bloomberg's December 2025 reporting has a headline that should give every supply chain executive pause.
The deal is not what it looks like from the press release, not even close.
Let me be precise about what the Busan deal actually achieved. The framing in most media coverage was US and China reach rare earth deal. That framing is optimistic to the point of being misleading.
So what actually happened?
In Busan, South Korea, on October 30th, 2025, Trump and Xi reached an agreement confirmed in a White House fact sheet. China agreed to suspend the October 9th MOFCOM announcement number 61, the sweeping escalation that would have denied export licenses to military-affiliated companies. That suspension runs until November 10th, 2026. In exchange, the United States removed 10 percentage points from the cumulative tariff rate on Chinese imports, specifically the fentanyl-related tariff surcharge, effective November 10th, 2025.
So the deal froze China back at the April baseline.
Exactly. The April 4th controls, the original 7-element licensing requirement, remain fully in force. They were not suspended. They were not relaxed. They were not addressed. Bloomberg reported in December 2025 that U.S. rare earth buyers were, quote, still seeing China curbs despite the Trump deal. The rare earth exchanges described the agreement as a tactical pause rather than genuine supply chain relief. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies published an analysis titled, China Pauses Some Rare Earth Export Curbs While Retaining Levers of Control. That title is the whole story.
So the scarier October escalation was paused, but the underlying April controls, the ones causing real market disruption, are still running.
And those original controls are doing real damage right now. Terbium oxide has risen 103% year-to-date as of early March 2026. Dysprosium oxide is trading around $191 per kilogram on industrial spot markets, but investment-grade material is closer to $930 per kilogram. The neodymium praseodymium alloy, the workhorse input for permanent magnets, surged 13.6% in a single week following the October escalation announcement. These are costs that flow directly through to EV manufacturers, defense contractors, and wind turbine builders.
Let's talk about who else is getting hit beyond the obvious U.S. defense contractors. I want to understand the Asia-wide exposure.
Japan is structurally the most exposed developed world economy. Japan has almost no domestic rare earth production and imports approximately 80% of its rare earth supply from China. Simultaneously, Japan is trying to scale up its EV manufacturing sector, its data center build-out for AI, and its defense spending, which the government has committed to doubling by 2027. Every one of those initiatives requires rare earth inputs that currently depend on Chinese processing.
Which is exactly why the Japan-Australia Critical Minerals Partnership has become so strategically prominent.
In June 2025, JX Advanced Metals Corporation, spun out of Nippon Mining, joined with RZ Resources and Marubeni to advance the Kopi Mine project in Australia and upgrade RZ's mineral separation plant. There is also a trilateral gallium project involving Alcoa and Sojitz Corporation, backed by Australia, Japan, and the United States. CSET described the US-Japan-Australia frameworks signed around the APEC summit in November 2025 as more concrete and ambitious than prior agreements.
But here's the timing problem.
It is a severe timing problem. Building a mineral separation plant, the processing infrastructure that converts rare earth ore into usable oxides and metals, takes 5 to 7 years from initial investment decision to full production capacity. You cannot negotiate your way out of a supply crisis on a 12-month timeline. The November 2026 deal expiry is less than 8 months away. Alternative supply chains from Australia and Japan are years from being able to absorb meaningful volumes.
What about the Taiwan semiconductor angle? Because TSMC is the most strategically sensitive company in the world on chip production, and you mentioned CSET flagged it.
TSMC uses cerium oxide in chip polishing. That's a lighter rare earth element. More critically, the advanced packaging and specialty chemical inputs for chip fabrication trace back through multi-tier supply chains to Chinese processing. When CSET flagged TSMC and the broader Taiwan semiconductor supply chain as particularly exposed in their translation of MOFCOM Notice 61, it was because the downstream component controls would capture materials that end up in chip fabs even if TSMC doesn't buy from China directly. The exposure is through Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers.
And that multi-tier opacity is exactly why procurement officers who think they have clean supply chains may not actually have clean supply chains.
Correct. The 2010 episode, The Last Time China Tightened Rare Earth Quotas, gave a useful precedent. Dysprosium hit $900 per kilogram at the 2011 peak. Eventually, China eased restrictions after a WTO ruling. The market normalized over 2 to 3 years. But the 2025 episode involves a more aggressive Chinese posture and a more deliberate US decoupling strategy that did not exist in 2010. The market normalization pathway is less clear this time.
South Korea is also in an interesting position here. Samsung and SK Hynix are in the middle of a generational ramp in high-bandwidth memory production for AI chips, and that supply chain has its own rare earth exposure.
HBM packaging and advanced DRAM fabrication both require specialty materials that trace back to Chinese processing at some tier. When Samsung announced its Taylor, Texas fab expansion and SK Hynix committed to Indiana, they were partly trying to insulate their supply chains from geopolitical exposure. But the rare earth inputs for the materials and chemicals that go into those fabs are not all sourced domestically. The decoupling at the fab level doesn't automatically solve the material supply chain dependency.
So in part 3, Alex has a contrarian take on the U.S. government's primary response to this, the MP materials bet, because the story the market is telling about MP is a lot cleaner than the reality on the ground.
The U.S. went from zero domestic supply to dependence on one domestic producer. That's progress, but progress and resilience are not the same thing.
Contrarian Corner. Alex, the consensus view is straightforward. MP Materials is the answer to U.S. rare earth dependency. Pentagon backing, massive new facility, end-to-end domestic production. What's your contrarian view?
My contrarian thesis has 2 parts. First, the MP Materials story is more fragile than the narrative suggests. Second, the U.S. government has made a concentrated bet that may have inadvertently created a new single point of failure in what was supposed to be a diversified supply chain strategy.
Walk me through the facts first.
In July 2025, the Department of Defense agreed to purchase $400 million of preferred stock in MP Materials, convertible into common stock, positioning DoD as approximately 15% owner of MP, making it potentially the company's largest shareholder. The Pentagon also extended a $150 million loan for heavy rare earth separation expansion at Mountain Pass, California, and committed to a 10-year price floor of $110 per kilogram for neodymium-praseodymium products. Then, in February 2026, MP announced the 10X campus, a $1.25 billion facility in Northlake, Texas, targeting 10,000 metric tons per year of neodymium iron boron magnets, backed by a 10-year Pentagon offtake commitment.
That is serious government commitment. Why the skepticism?
2 reasons. First, by channeling the bulk of government resources into a single company, the U.S. effectively defunded the alternative. Lynas Rare Earths, the Australian company that had been developing a heavy rare earth processing plant in Seadrift, Texas, is now described by rare earth exchanges as unlikely to proceed. Their Texas project is in limbo because DoD chose to concentrate its support on MP instead. Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy noted that the structure of the MP-DoD equity deal raises legitimate questions about long-term policy governance, specifically whether it is appropriate for the U.S. government to become both equity shareholder and offtake guarantor for a single commercial entity.
So the U.S. went from zero domestic capacity to dependence on one domestic producer. That's better than zero, but it's not a diversified supply chain.
A policy failure at Mountain Pass, a geological problem, a labor dispute, a fire, a commercial bankruptcy becomes a systemic national security failure, not a commercial setback, because the government has so concentrated its bet. And there are technical constraints that don't show up in the press releases. Mountain Pass is a carbon-atide deposit. It is relatively rich in the light rare earths, neodymium, praseodymium, cerium. The 10X campus and the DoD price floor both focus on NdPr products. Those are commercially important, absolutely.
But the heavy rare earths, dysprosium and terbium, are different.
Dysprosium and terbium are found in ion absorption deposits, primarily in southern China, Jiangxi, Fujian, Guangdong provinces. Mountain Pass has only limited concentrations of these elements. And dysprosium and terbium are the elements most critical for heat-resistant permanent magnets, the magnets that go into F-35 engine actuators, submarine propulsion motors, and the advanced EV motors that run at high temperatures. Terbium oxide is up 103% year-to-date specifically because the April controls bit hardest on these heavy elements, and the U.S. has no credible domestic alternative production path for them on a near-term timeline.
So the U.S. is building world-class NdPr magnet capacity, but the most strategically sensitive elements, the ones actually constraining the defense industrial base, are still overwhelmingly dependent on China.
Democratic senators and congressional analysts raised this concern explicitly in February 2026. Breaking Defense reported that lawmakers were questioning the equity deal structure, partly because the concentrated government bet creates a moral hazard. If MP faces operational problems, the government will face pressure to bail it out rather than allow supply chain disruption to U.S. defense programs. That is not a clean commercial relationship.
Here is the broader historical question I want to put to our listeners. China imposed modest rare earth export restrictions in 2010. Dysprosium hit $900 per kilogram. The WTO ruled against China in 2014. Prices normalized. Did the West learn anything from that episode, or did it go back to the same dependency?
The honest answer is mostly the latter. Between 2014 and 2024, Western companies largely renormalized their Chinese rare earth sourcing because it was the cheapest option. The MP Materials restart at Mountain Pass was happening, but slowly. No Western government made a sustained, coordinated push to build alternative processing capacity outside of a few Japanese initiatives. And Japan, which did build some alternative sourcing from Southeast Asia and Australia after 2010, is actually in a better relative position than the US today because of that earlier discipline.
But the scale of current demand is so much larger than 2010. AI data centers, next-generation EVs, military build-out across multiple countries simultaneously.
The demand profile has fundamentally changed. In 2010, the primary driver of rare earth demand was consumer electronics and hybrid vehicles in relatively early ramp stages. In 2026, you have simultaneous acceleration of EV production, wind power build-out, AI infrastructure, and defense modernization across NATO, Japan, Australia, and South Korea. The IEA estimated that demand for rare earth permanent magnets could increase fourfold by 2040. China's processing monopoly becomes geometrically more valuable as that demand grows.
So the 2026 deal expiry isn't just a political negotiation inflection point. It's arriving at exactly the moment when Western demand for these materials is structurally accelerating.
And Beijing knows that. The fact that China designed the October deal to expire on November 10, 2026, rather than offering a more permanent arrangement, is itself a negotiating signal. China is maintaining optionality. The levers are not being surrendered. They are being suspended.
In Part 4, 3 concrete action items, including what to watch as November 2026 approaches, and where the real risk in this story actually lives.
The most important risk is the one that is hiding in plain sight. Let's get to it.
Action items. Alex, 3 specific ones.
Action Item 1 is for investors watching the critical mineral space. Understand that MP Materials, ticker MP on the NYSE, is now effectively a quasi-government entity. It has a Pentagon equity stake, a 10-year price floor guarantee, and a government-backed offtake commitment. That changes its risk profile in both directions. The downside protection from government backing is real. Mountain Pass is unlikely to face a commercial financing crisis while the DoD is a 15% equity holder. But the regulatory and political risk that comes with having the Department of Defense as your largest shareholder is equally real. Democratic lawmakers raised concerns in February 2026 about the equity deal structure. That is the first signal that this arrangement will be subject to ongoing political scrutiny and congressional oversight that a purely commercial company would not face.
And the timeline matters.
The 10X campus, $1.25 billion in North Lake, Texas, targeting 10,000 metric tons per year of NdFeB magnets, is a decade-long build-out. Groundbreaking, construction, equipment installation, ramp-up, qualification. Investors who buy MP on the rare earth security narrative need multi-year patience, not a quarterly trade. The near-term price action in MP stock will be driven more by NdPr oxide spot prices and the status of the DoD price floor than by the long-term strategic narrative.
And for anyone watching the gap that Linus left behind.
The Linus, Texas situation is worth monitoring for a different reason. A second large-scale U.S. rare earth processing operation that was supposed to exist is now in limbo. That gap doesn't disappear because MP is expanding. It means the U.S. heavy rare earth processing capacity, dysprosium and terbium specifically, has no credible near-term domestic alternative to Mountain Pass. If Mountain Pass faces operational disruption, there is no backup.
And action item 2?
Action item 2 is for anyone in defense, aerospace, advanced manufacturing, or EV supply chain procurement. November 10, 2026 is not a surprise cliff edge. It is a known, visible, dated risk that procurement organizations should be planning around right now. The current deal only suspends the October 9th MOFCOM escalation. The April 4th baseline controls on the 7 elements are still active and still creating friction. If your supply chain for dysprosium, terbium, or yttrium through any tier still routes through Chinese processors, you have approximately 7 months to either build strategic inventory, qualify alternative suppliers from Australia or Japan, or develop substitution pathways. CSIS and the Foundation for Defensive Democracies have published detailed supply chain exposure maps. Those are not academic documents. They are operational planning tools.
And for technology executives, semiconductor supply chain managers in particular.
Read the CSET translation of MOFCOM Notice 2025 number 61 directly. Georgetown's team translated it in full. The downstream exposure through multi-tier supply chains is more pervasive than most direct purchase data suggests. A chip fab that does not buy rare earths from China directly may still have significant exposure through specialty chemical suppliers or polishing compound manufacturers 2 tiers up. Understanding where your actual Tier 2 and Tier 3 exposure sets is not a political exercise, it is supply chain risk management.
Action item 3.
Action item 3 is the macro watch signal. Monitor China's MOFCOM export license approval data from July 2026 onward. That is when renewal discussions, if any, will start to become visible in official government signaling. In 2010, China's quota tightening gave 6 to 12 months of advance warning before the market spike reached peak levels. In the current cycle, the deal framework does not automatically renew.
If China allows the November 10th deadline to pass and re-implements the MOFCOM number 61 regime, the supply shock would hit a market that has already priced in some elevated risk, but not the full escalation scenario. Terbium oxide is up 103% year-to-date with the deal in place. Dysprosium oxide has nearly tripled from trough levels. Model what happens to prices and industrial margins if the suspension lifts and the military affiliation denial clause takes effect.
Let me summarize the core arc. China spent 30 years building a processing monopoly over rare earth materials, not by finding more ore, but by mastering the chemistry. In April 2025, it used that monopoly as a trade lever for the first time since 2010, but this time in a world of AI infrastructure, sixth-generation fighter jets, and electric vehicle supply chains. The October escalation pushed the US and China to a deal in Busan, but that deal is a one-year tactical pause, not a structural resolution.
The U.S. response, centered on MP materials, is real investment with real intent. Restoring end-to-end domestic magnet production for the first time in decades matters. But one mine, one company, in one state, with government-backed price supports, is not a substitute for 30 years of Chinese processing infrastructure. And Mountain Pass has structural limitations specifically in the heavy rare earths, dysprosium and terbium, that are the most militarily and industrially critical.
And the November 2026 clock is ticking on a supply chain dependency that the Western technology and defense complex has not yet fully internalized.
The rare earth story is ultimately a story about the difference between geological abundance and industrial processing power. China didn't win this market by finding more ore. It won by mastering the chemistry. And chemistry cannot be replicated with a tariff cut and a funding announcement, however sincere.
In our next episode, we are going to look at Vietnam, which is sitting at a unique and underappreciated intersection right now. Vietnam is one of the largest recipients of China Plus One manufacturing investment, one of the U.S.'s largest trade deficit partners, and simultaneously home to significant rare earth deposits of its own. The Section 301 trade case, the ongoing tariff negotiations, and Vietnam's rare earth export potential make this one of the most complex and consequential geopolitical economic stories in Asia in 2026.
Stay data-driven. Bye.